Thank you for inviting me into your school. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Kevin Hemp. I'm the water guy. I work for Coachella Valley Water District, and I was invited here today to talk to your third grade class about water in the valley. And for third grade, we actually have 4 water topics that we address. So let's just bring them up. First off, we're going to talk about the desert that we live in. Now, if you didn't know, the Coachella Valley where we live is a desert. So now you know. We're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about the first people who lived here, the Cahuilla Indians. Then we're going to talk about how they found and used water here in this desert. And finally, we're going to compare that and talk to our water use today. So let's jump into it and let's talk about the desert that we live in. So here is a picture of our desert. Now, I don't know about you, but I happen to think this is a very beautiful picture of our desert. But I have to be honest, this is what the Coachella Valley looks like when you water it. So by watering, I mean, I know you've seen sprinklers out there that they spray water over the land. And, you know, amazing things happen when water meets the desert. The desert turns green. The grass is nice and beautiful. The trees are nice and lush. The flowers are all colorful and beautiful. But honestly, if you were to shut those sprinklers off or that irrigation off, what would happen? Yeah, all of those beautiful plants would dry up. And the Coachella Valley would go back to looking like the desert that it truly is, which is this right here. So I know this shouldn't be a shock to us, because if you've lived here, you've seen parts of the desert that look like this. And so you can drive around the Coachella Valley and you'll see well-watered places that are nice and green and beautiful right next to dry, barren places like this here. The reality is the Coachella Valley is so dry because we get very little rain. It is a desert after all. So on average, the Coachella Valley gets only 3 inches of rain per year. That makes us one of the driest regions in the entire world. Very, very little bit of rainfall every year on average. Now this is a concern to people because, as you know, water is important. We cannot live very long without it. We need water to survive. And so living here, people kind of scratch their heads and they say, how are we able to live here? Where do we get our water from with so little rainfall? Well, the good news is that even though we only get about 3 inches of rain per year, we do have an abundant source of water to draw from. Now, you can't see it. It's actually hidden from our sight. The water that our main source of water here in the valley comes from under our feet. It comes from under the sand. It comes from underground. And it is stored in a geologic formation that we call an aquifer. Say it with me, aquifer. There you go. So not really sure what the aquifer looks like. Can't see it because it's buried underground. But if we had to guess, we know that it is full of water. And it is good, clean, fresh water, naturally filtered by the sand. I know that, it may sound strange that water in the soil can actually be clean. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But just know this, that the water in the aquifer is good, clean, fresh water. And this is the water that you drink. This is the water in the Coachella Valley that we send, the Coachella Valley Water District sends it to your home, to your schools, to your businesses. So just so that we understand each other, the aquifer is not some mysterious underground lake. It's not like you could dig a hole and go swimming down there. The aquifer actually is just really, really wet sand and gravel and rocks. So we know that the water is there, but how did it get there? Well, currently there's 3 ways that water goes into the aquifer. The first way is from melted snow or snow melt. So every winter, Snow piles high in the mountains that surround us here. Every spring and summer, that snow melts. It runs off the mountains and makes streams and rivers. And then that runoff, as we called it, that melted snow, finds its way down to the Coachella Valley, and it soaks down into the aquifer. The process of water soaking down into the aquifer, we call that percolation. So, maybe one way to understand this is if you have houseplants at home. Perhaps you have a houseplant that you have to water regularly. So if you have a houseplant, like it's in a pot, and you have to water it, if you pour water into the pot, does the water sit on top of the soil or does it soak down into the soil? And if you've done this before, you know the water soaks down into the soil. And that's what's happening here. The melted snow comes down to the valley and soaks down into the soil, continues soaking down until it reaches the aquifer. So that's the first way water gets into the aquifer. The second way is from rain. Now, it's true, we don't get a lot of rain here, 3 inches, but we'll take it. Every little bit helps. We appreciate any rain that we get. Sadly, the rain that we get and the snow that we get, it's not enough to sustain all of the people that live here. We need water. The rain provides water, the snow melt provides water, but that's not enough. So as a water district, we have to bring in even more water to sustain the people that live here. And the way we do that is through pipes. So in addition to the rain and the snow, we are connected through pipes to a river about 100 miles from here called the Colorado River. Maybe you've heard of it before. If you look at this picture, the pipes, they're buried underground. You don't see the pipes. But in this picture here, you can just see the tips of the pipes sticking out from the ground, and coming out of these pipes is water, and it's gushing out of these pipes. Well, if you could trace those pipes back, they would go underground for about 100 miles, and then they connect to that river, the Colorado River. So we bring in river water into the valley through the pipes. We release it into the valley. And if you look at the arrows there, you notice they're going in this downward motion into the aquifer. What does that tell us? It tells us that the river water we're bringing in from far away is going into the aquifer. So this is our third way that we get water into the aquifer, is from the river. So 3 ways we get water into the aquifer: from the snow, from the rain, and from the river. Okay. Now there used to be a 4th way that water got into the aquifer, but it doesn't happen anymore. I thought it'd be fun to talk about. It was about 400 years ago. About 400 years ago, a large portion of the Coachella Valley was entirely underwater. It was a big, huge lake. It's long since dried up, but we know that the lake used to be here because if you look at the mountains that surround the Coachella Valley, there's a line on the mountains. Now in this picture, you can see a very clear line on the mountains. That's what we call a water line, or a high water line, or a water mark. And that tells us that at one time, this whole area was full of water. So if we use our imagination, it might look something like this. And we got some fish swimming around in there and the whole bit. Now, that lake that used to be here, as I mentioned earlier, has long since dried up. Now, if you had to guess, where do you think a lot of that water ended up? Yes, the aquifer. You are correct. Again, that doesn't happen anymore, but some of the water that's in our aquifer today is from that lake that used to be here many years ago. Now, just for fun, if you look at this picture here, you have to look very, very closely. We're looking towards the right side of the screen. And then if you go down, you see a road. And if you look very, very closely, there's a car down there. And I like to point that out because it shows how deep this lake used to be. If that car was there when the lake was full, the car would be under 300 feet of water. So this was a very large lake, contained a tremendous amount of water. And also, the car that's down there, if they were to, park the car and get out and start digging around in the sand here, they would find something interesting. They would find these. They would find shells. Now, if you've lived here for any length of time, chances are you've been kicking around in the dirt and you've found shells. There's millions of them. They're scattered all over the Coachella Valley. Now, what's interesting about these shells, these are not the same type of shells you find on the beach at the ocean. The kinds of shells you find on the beach at the ocean, those are saltwater shells. Those are critters that came from the ocean. Okay. The little critters that used to live in these shells were freshwater snails. So the reason that's good to know is because it tells us the type of water that they lived in. These are freshwater snail shells. And since we drink fresh water, we don't drink salt water, we drink fresh water, the fact that we know that the water from this lake went into the aquifer, the fact that we know that it was fresh, that's good. That's good. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so let's talk about how the lake filled up and why it disappeared. To understand this, we're going to have to use a map. So this is the map we're going to use to understand the filling of that big lake and the draining of that big lake. If you have trouble understanding how to read a map, that's okay. We're going to read this one together. Just know this, a map is a drawing. Anybody can draw a map. You can draw a map. A map is a drawing of a piece of the earth, actually, from way up in the sky looking straight down. So we have to use our imagination here. Imagine what the earth would look like if you were a bird flying way up in the air looking straight down. If you could draw a picture of that, we would call it a map. Maybe to help you imagine this a little better, let's look at the view of the earth outside the window of an airplane. So if you've ever been fortunate enough to fly on an airplane, maybe you got to peek out the window and look at the earth below, and like in this picture here. When you do that, you see that everything below is very tiny. The cities are tiny, the houses are tiny, the roads are tiny. Everything's very, very small, but you can see over a great distance. Now, if you could draw a picture of that, you would have a map. So that's what we're looking at here. This is a map. Now, when you look at a map, it's helpful to know where you are on that map. And for us, we're in the Coachella Valley. So let's find where the Coachella Valley is on this map. The Coachella Valley, I outlined it in red, make it easy to see. The Coachella Valley is here. There we are, right there. Let's see, here is a picture of the Coachella Valley. And I like this picture of the valley because, we say so often that the Coachella Valley is a desert, and it is. But when you look at pictures of the valley like this one, it almost does not look like a desert, but it is. We can see, as I mentioned in the beginning, you have pieces of land that are well watered, and we know they're watered because they're green. You can see those well watered pieces of land. In this case, it's farmland. These are farmers growing food for us to eat by using water. But also you can see pieces of land that are very dry, indicated by kind of like the yellowish straw color of the land. So that would be portions of the Coachella Valley that are still in its natural condition. But put together, it actually looks not much like a desert, but it is a desert. So I thought I'd point that out again. Okay, back to the slide. On our map, there is a large body of water still present here in the Coachella Valley that I'd like to outline on the map. I drew it in blue. Maybe you've seen it before. It's the Salton Sea. And so there it is there. The Salton Sea, you could say it's kind of a left behind portion of that big lake that used to be here. But there it is. If you've never seen the Salton Sea, here's a picture of it. It happens to be the largest lake in California. Salton Sea, it's got some problems. It's dying off. It is. It's very salty, saltier than the Pacific Ocean. There are many government agencies working to try to fix the Salton Sea, but so far we kind of have to keep our fingers crossed and hope that they are able to fix it, in fact. But there it is, Salton Sea, largest lake in California, right in the Coachella Valley. Okay, now on our map, I'd like to point your attention to this thin blue line that's on the right portion of the screen. That thin blue line represents the river I mentioned earlier. That is the Colorado River. It's the 7th longest river in the United States, 1,450 miles long. And it actually runs through 7 states, including California. And here is the southern portion of the river. You can see it's actually draining into the ocean. At the bottom of the screen, a place called the Gulf. The Gulf of what? Gulf of California, which actually happens to be in Mexico. So it's draining into the Gulf of California in Mexico. This is how the Colorado River flows today. But if you were to look at the flow of the river 400 years ago, it would look different. It actually would look like this. Back then, the river did a U-turn and it flipped, if you will, and it started flowing north, and it flowed into the Coachella Valley, and it filled up this huge area of land and made this huge giant lake that we often call Old Lake Kahuilla, or probably more commonly, Ancient Lake Kahuilla. Old Lake Kahuilla or Ancient Lake Kahuilla. And so you can see, I left the Salton Sea in there so you can compare the size of the Salton Sea to how big the Old Lake used to be. The Old Lake was 6 times larger than today's Salton Sea. So it was pretty significant, pretty large body of water. Interesting name for a lake, Cahuilla. Why do you think they named it Cahuilla? Any ideas? I mean, if it was up to me, I would call it like Big Lake or something like that because it's so big. But if you said it was named Lake Cahuilla after the native people that lived along the shore of the lake, you would be correct. The Cahuilla Indians, the indigenous people of this area, actually built villages around the shoreline of this lake. So Lake Cahuilla was a source of water for the first people that lived here, the Cahuilla Indians. Not only was it a source of water, but it was also a source of food. I'd have a picture of some of the fish traps that still remain even today. We can take a look at them. But before we do that, let's throw the Coachella Valley back into the slide again so you can see how much of the Coachella Valley was underwater back then. There it is. So the red portion is overlaid with the blue portion, and you can see how much of the lake came up into the Coachella Valley back then, 400 years ago. Okay, here's an old photograph, again, taken from an airplane looking down. We're looking at the side of a mountain. And what we're looking at, I'd like to draw your attention to, there's these little holes. If you see, they're in a nice, usually actually straight lines that go across the screen from left to right or right to left, however you're looking. But you see those holes. Those were made by people. They were made by the Cahuilla Indians, and they're actually fish traps. They were built into Old Lake Cahuilla when the lake used to be here to catch fish. And so if you could look at these fish traps up close, they would look like this. Here's a picture of one of them up close. There it is right there. And you can see it's a pretty simple structure. Basically, it's just a ring of rocks. But you have to imagine that when they built these fish traps, they were underwater, the fish traps were. And so if we use our imagination, it might look something like this. And I was told the way that these worked, the Cahuilla, they would put food into these fish traps that would lure the fish in. The fish would come in and start nibbling on the food. And then they had a trap door that they could shut around the back of the fish, and the fish would get trapped in there. And so the fish could live in there, and they could feed the fish in there. They were kind of like little ponds that held fish. And then whenever the Cahuilla wanted lunch or dinner or breakfast maybe, they walked along and they scooped out a fish from the pond, and that was a meal for them. So those are the fish traps. Okay, well, we know how the lake filled up, but why did it disappear? The reason it disappeared was because of something we call the bathtub effect. So imagine this. Imagine if you filled a bathtub and you forgot to turn off the water. What would happen? Yeah, it would spill over. And that's what happened to Old Lake Cahuilla. The Colorado River came in, it filled up and up and up, all the way up to that line you see on the mountains, and then it couldn't hold any more water, and the water, it just spilled over. And when it spilled over, the water started to drain out and flow back to Mexico, and then back to the ocean, back to the Pacific Ocean at the Gulf of California. And so now, and this actually pushed the Colorado River back to Mexico again. And now we have a situation where water is draining out of the lake. Water is actively soaking from the lake into the aquifer. And we haven't talked about evaporation, but there's a portion of the water cycle where water actually evaporates. It goes into the air, changes from a liquid to a gas, and is converted into clouds that you see in the sky. So it's actually evaporating water into the sky as well. So I said all that to say that Lake Cahuilla was drying up very quickly, and it was just a matter of years before the entire lake disappeared. And all we have left today to remind us that that lake was ever here, well, there's a portion of the Salton Sea. We have the Salton Sea as a reminder. We have shells in the soil. We have a water line on the mountains and a lot of water in our aquifer. So that is our desert. These pictures here remind us of the first people that lived here, the Cahuilla. The Cahuilla have lived here for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And these pictures remind us of how they lived way back then. These pictures here, the people you see here are members of the modern tribe today, but we're going to talk about their ancestors and how they lived hundreds of years ago. And to do that, we have to go back in time. And to go back in time, we have to use our imagination. So if we imagine what a Cahuilla village looked like in the Coachella Valley 300 or 400 years ago, it would probably look something like this. Now, in this picture here, you see a village. It's a Cahuilla village, and you can see that they have houses in their village. To us, we probably would not call them houses. We would call them huts. But to the Cahuilla, these, in fact, were their houses. They had a name for their house. It was called a Kish, spelled K-I-S-H, Kish. Very simple structure. It was made from branches from the mesquite trees. They were bent over, tied together with fibers from the yucca plants, and those were covered over with palm leaves or palm fronds from the California fan palms that grow here. The structures kept out the wind. When it was cold, it kept them warm. When it was hot, it kept them cool. So very simple but very effective structures. As a water district, our interest in the placement of the village is interesting because it's related to water. In this case, you can see the Cahuilla chose to build this village right up next to the mountains. And that was fairly common. So if any guesses as to how building your village right up next to the mountains would help you get water? Any ideas on that? Okay. Yes, it's snow melt. You remember back from one of the first slides, you saw the melted snow coming down the side of the mountains. Well, when the snow melted, guess who was there to collect the water? Yeah, the Cahuilla. And so this made sense. Water is important. We need water to survive. So the Cahuilla put their villages next to water sources, like the snow melt. So let's talk about how they found and used water in the desert. This actually was a Cahuilla village site at one time. This is a place called Tockwitz Canyon in Palm Springs. You can see the snow melt here. It's coming off the side of the mountain. It's collecting on the desert floor. The water in this pond-like area here is soaking into the aquifer. And this makes sense. To me, it's like, if I need water, look, there's water, let's build a village there. That kind of makes sense. What's harder to understand, though, there were also villages built away from the mountains out in the open desert, in areas like this. And as a matter of fact, there were actually quite a number of Cahuilla villages built out in the open desert. And so I have a map here that shows Cahuilla village sites that we're aware of today. Let's take a look at it. There it is. And so on this map here, if you're having trouble understanding what we're looking at, there's a legend on this map. It's in the lower left-hand corner of the picture, and you see a description down there. It says legend, and if you look below legend, you can see there's yellow means desert soil. So on this map, every place that's colored yellow represents desert soil. You kind of have like the reddish, bluish, jagged areas that represents mountains, and then the green represents grass and forest areas, and then you see those blue rectangles or squares that are outlined in red. Those are Cahuilla village sites. So every place you see a little rectangle on this map is an indicator of where we know there used to be a Cahuilla village site. And you can see there were actually quite a number of them right out in the middle of the desert soil areas. The villages that were out in these remote areas away from the mountains, they got water from the ground and from the aquifer, in fact. And there were two ways they could get water from the aquifer. One was through natural springs. So it's pretty interesting here. In the Coachella Valley, we have this situation where groundwater from the aquifer, in some cases, actually comes up to the surface, and it collects on the surface, and you can see it. And this is one of those places. These are called springs. The water that's formed here we call an oasis. This is a Thousand Palms oasis in the Coachella Preserve in Thousand Palms. And the Cahuilla used to live in areas like this. They would put villages here because of the abundant water supply. So that was one way they got water from the aquifer. Now, what about, how do you get water out of an aquifer if there's no spring? Well, you have to dig for it. And so the Cahuilla also dug for their water. They dug what we call wells, and we'll talk about what a well is in a second here. This picture kind of helps us understand how the water in the aquifer, in some cases, actually rises to the surface and creates a little oasis. What happens is some of the water in the aquifer moves through the soil, the sand and the rock and the gravel, and then it hits a split in the earth. The split is what we call a fault line. The fault lines are associated with earthquakes, the movement of the Earth's crust. But the water underground in the aquifer will come and it'll hit that fault, if you will, and then it can't get past it. And so the water then pushes up behind the line and actually bubbles up to the surface. So that's kind of how that works. Okay. We were talking about digging for water. The Cahuilla also dug what we call wells. They dug holes in the ground to get water. Did the Cahuilla have any modern tools to dig with? The answer is no, they did not. And by modern, I mean tools that were made of metal. The Cahuilla had no tools made of metal. Their tools were made from things they could find in the desert. So whatever you could find in the desert, they could probably make a tool out of it. That would be rocks, that would be sticks, wood, shells, clay, animal bones, all of the above. Here's an example of some of the stone tools the Cahuilla used for different purposes. Let's see. These two larger stones, the one on the left and the one on the right, they're similar. They're called pestles. They were used for crushing and grinding stuff. The one on the left was used for crushing and grinding seeds to turn it, to make it to soften it up, to turn it into what we call meal, to where you could add water to it and boil it and eat it as a type of porridge or kind of like oatmeal, or maybe bake it and turn it into a type of bread. The stone tool on the right is also a pestle. This was used for making medicines, even paint in some cases. And by paint, I mean they would find colorful things in nature, like flowers and berries and things like that, and crush them up, extract the color, and they could actually use that for painting. So when the Cahuilla would take a pestle, whatever they were going to crush and grind up, they would lay it on a flat stone, and then they would smash the material over the flat stone with the pestle. And over time, it would actually drill a hole into the flat stone, like you see here. You see that hole drilled in the stone. The hole actually became a tool itself. We call it a mortar. So these are often referred to as a mortar and a pestle. And so the deeper the hole, the more material you could put in there, and the more you could grind up. So here's a piece of pumice. Pumice is actually, it's volcanic ash. It's actually consolidated, very light. If you picked it up, it's as light as styrofoam. In fact, if you throw it in the water, it'll float. Pumice. You could use it as a type of sandpaper for sanding or smoothing surfaces. Today, you can actually buy it at a pharmacy. You can go to like Walgreens or something, and people buy pumice to smooth out rough skin. Like for me, I have like these really rough elbows. I could probably just get them nice and smooth with some pumice. This tool here, it's a rock. It has a little notch in it. This is only half the tool. There was actually two identical like this. One would go on the top. This was an arrow straightener. It was used for straightening arrows. One would go on the top, one would go on the bottom, make the arrow straight. This here is a hammer, or what remains of a hammer, I guess. But anyway, you get the idea. The Cahuilla had to get creative with the tools that they used and made. As a water district, since we're talking about water, I really want to focus on the tool that they used to dig for water. And it was a Cahuilla digging tool. It was actually made of clay. If you've ever molded clay before, kind of like Play-Doh, you know that when it's wet, it's really, you can shape it into just about anything. And in this case, the Cahuilla would take clay and they would shape it into little scoops. They could make bowls and pottery and all kinds of things out of it. But in this case here, they would make these scoops. They would bake them in the fire, get them nice and hard, and then they could dig. And so they dug what we call wells. They dug for water. Now, if you're not familiar with the term well, basically a well is just a hole in the ground that has water in it. That is a well. When I think of a well, I have this picture in my mind that I think of. This is what I think of when I think of a well. Maybe this is what you think of when you think of a well also. A wishing well. Like if we saw something like this today, we'd probably run up to it, throw a penny in there, and make a wish. This, in fact, is a well. If you were to look down there, there's water at the bottom of it. And to get the water out, you use a bucket and a rope to pull the water out. But I'm showing you this so you can compare it to a Cahuilla well. The Cahuilla well actually looks nothing like the wishing well. So here's a picture of a Cahuilla Indian well. Okay, Cahuilla Indian well. I know it's an old picture. This picture was taken in the year 1903 here in the Coachella Valley. What we're looking at is there's a hole in the ground. Maybe it'll help if you look at the bottom of the photograph, kind of starting at the left and going kind of towards the middle, there are steps. Can you see the steps? This is what's called a walk-down well. The Cahuilla actually not only dug a deep hole into the desert, but they dug steps so they could walk down into the well to get the water. So I find it amazing that the Cahuilla dug wells like this with tools like this. Pretty amazing. Wow. This well, when back in 1903, was 30 feet deep. 30 feet. That's as deep as a 3-story building is tall. It's pretty amazing. To get the water out of the well, the Cahuilla made water pots out of clay. This is a clay water pot. They had a Spanish word for it that they used to describe it. It was called an olla, O-L-L-A, olla. And so this was carried down into the well, filled with water, and then carried back to the villages and stored in the villages. So we have that. I'm sad to say, there are no longer any Cahuilla wells in existence today. They're all gone. They actually were quite unstable. And what I mean by that is if you look at this well here, the sides are very steep, it's very deep, and we have earthquakes here in the valley. So whenever the ground would shake, these wells could collapse, which made them very dangerous. Because if someone was down there getting water and there was an earthquake, it could cave in on them. So what happened over time as these caved in, rather than redig them, modern wells came along, which are much safer, much sturdier, and so the old were abandoned and the new came in. But with that said, there is a city here in the Coachella Valley named after this site. Now, I say this site. In reality, it's disputed where this picture was taken. But if it was not this exact site, it was one very close or very similar. So you get the idea. So which city was named after this site? Let's see if we can guess. I'll give you 4 choices. Was it 1, Palm Springs, 2, Rancho Mirage, 3, La Quinta, or 4, Indian Wells? Of course, Indian Wells. Yeah, I know, it's too easy, right? In fact, I was told there were 3 Indian Wells in Indian Wells. So it was called Indian Wells rather than just Indian Well, which would have been 1. But okay, so that's how the Cahuilla found and used water. Let's move on to our final topic and let's talk about how we use water today. One thing we still have in common with the Cahuilla when it comes to water are wells. We still use wells even today. Although we do not use the hand-dug wells like the Cahuilla used to use, we actually use modern wells, which are dug not with machines, or not by hand, but with machines, like this machine right here. This is called a well rig, and this drills a hole in 30-foot sections. And the idea is they'll drill a 30-foot hole, and then they'll put another drill bit on it, and then they'll drill another 30, and it'll go down 60 feet, and then 90 feet. And then how deep do you think our wells are today? Any ideas? It's pretty amazing. I think you're going to be shocked. On average, our wells today are 1,000 feet deep. At least 1,000 feet. In fact, we have some wells that are as deep as the Empire State Building is tall. If you've never seen the Empire State Building, it's a famous skyscraper in New York City. Here's a picture of it. There it is. And it is 1,250 feet tall. We have wells that are that deep, some even deeper. It's pretty amazing. Now, when people hear this, not only are they shocked usually, but they inevitably ask, why are the wells so deep in the Coachella Valley? Is that because the water has gone down that far that we have to drill the wells that deeply? I'm glad to say the answer is no. It has to do with water quality. It turns out the best and the freshest water is deeper down. It kind of works like this, and it goes back to where I mentioned that our water is naturally filtered by the sand and the gravel. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is you see the blue kind of coming out of the sky. Let's use our imagination. That's supposed to be rain. So if it rains here, it's going to make the ground wet. And when the ground gets wet, some of that rainwater is going to soak down into the soil. But as it soaks down into the soil, I'd like you to notice what happens to that water over time. Near the surface, the water is undrinkable, okay? It actually does what you think water will do when it mixes with dirt. It becomes dirty, okay? But notice what happens over time. As the water goes deeper through the soil, the sand and the gravel actually starts to work as a filter and actually starts to clean up the water, to remove those particles of soil, those fine soil particles and other contaminants. And by the time you get down a few hundred feet, that water is filtered and ready to drink in most cases. So the question is, would we rather take our water from up near the surface or down deep? And the answer is down deep. So we have that. Okay, so let's take a look at a modern well. Here we go. There's a modern well. I know it's not much to look at. Probably the most exciting thing about the modern well to me is this slab of cement that these guys are standing on. If you look closely, there's a slab of cement under their feet. You may say, well, what's so exciting about that? What's exciting about that is what's under the cement. What's under the cement is a hole, probably about that big around, and this hole is deep. If somebody were to fall in that hole, it'd be like falling off the top of the Empire State Building. Whew, that's kind of a scary thought. So we cover it up for safety, not only for your safety, but to keep the water clean, so no one can fall in there. So don't worry about falling in there. Then we have the well actually sticking up out of the cement. You can see it in the background there. That's what we call a pump. It's an electric pump that actually pulls water from the aquifer. So when that pump kicks on and it starts to spin and to run, it works almost kind of like an elevator, and it lifts that water at a very fast rate out of the aquifer, and then it transfers it to a pipe. You can see the pipe there, and you can see that the pipe is sending the water a certain direction. And the pipe is sending the water actually to these huge round steel water tanks that we call reservoirs. The reservoirs, we usually try to build them up on the sides of mountains. And here's a picture of 2 reservoirs that hold fresh water from the wells. There we go, 1 and 2. Let's see. So there's the pipe from the well. It's actually pumping the water uphill to these water tanks, again called reservoirs. And we fill those with fresh water. And these tanks store huge amounts of fresh water for us that we can use in our homes. So if you look at the little water tank there in the back, it holds 5 million gallons of water, which is a lot of water. But consider this, the big tank in the front of the picture holds twice as much. So how much would that be? Yeah, you're right, 10 million gallons of water. So combined, we have 15 million gallons in storage here in this reservoir. So let's see how the water, so this shows us how the water gets from the aquifer to the well to the reservoir. Let's see how it gets from the reservoir to your house. Let's see, what do we have here? Okay, so what we have here, the well has turned off and now water is leaving the reservoir and it's traveling back down through the same pipe. So in this situation, water can travel up the pipe or back down through the pipe. We call this an in-out system. So if the well is turned off, and let's say you're at home and you turn on your sink, water then will flow downhill from the reservoir and enter the pipe that goes to your house, and it'll come right out your sink, just like that, like magic. It's pretty amazing. However, if the well is running, then it goes like this. Water is going uphill through the pipes, filling the reservoir, and then let's say you turn on your sink. Turn on your sink, water still comes out, but in this case, it's not coming from the reservoir, it's actually coming straight from the well. And so I hope that is not too confusing. but it's an in-out system. So that's kind of how water gets to your house. Okay. Oh, here's the same two reservoirs from a different vantage point, different perspective. This is in the La Quinta Cove, if you happen to be from there. These are just, there's actually a bunch of reservoirs up there, but these are two of the main ones. So if you could imagine, these two reservoirs actually feed this whole section here. Pretty amazing. So when you turn on your sink, if you live in La Quinta Cove, most likely the water's coming from one of those two reservoirs. Okay, some food for thought. Next time you turn the sink on at your house, you might take a minute and think, hey, where's this water coming from? Okay, I know it's coming from the aquifer. From the aquifer, I know it goes to a well. From the well, it's pumped uphill to a reservoir. From the reservoir, it comes to my house. And I also know that I'm not the first person to use this water. As these pictures show us here, these are some people that used the water before us. On the left, we have the Cahuilla Indians who first tapped the aquifer here. On the right, haven't talked about these guys yet. These are the pioneers. These are the farmers and city planners that built the first towns and cities here in the Coachella Valley, and they use water from the aquifer as well. We talk more about the pioneers in 4th grade, so we'll talk about them next year. But you just say, you know, there were people that used this water before me. I use it today, and there's also going to be people in the future that need to use this water. And with that thought in mind, we should think conservation. We should be aware of the water that we use and make a conscious effort to conserve the water, to save the water, to not waste the water. It's true, we do have a lot of water in our aquifer, but it's what we call a limited supply. There's only so much of it. So it's wise to only use what you need and to not waste the water. So this is our mascot, Tudor Tortoise. I didn't introduce him at the beginning, but he's saying to us here, you can help save water. So let's look at some just quick ways we can all help save water. 1, turn off the water when you brush your teeth. Yes, water off. Save about a gallon of water. Do that twice a day, save 2 gallons. If everyone in the Coachella Valley did that every day, twice a day, 1 million gallons a day that we would save. So a little bit goes a long ways if everyone's involved. So turn off the water when you brush your teeth. Here's one. Try to take shorter showers. Yes, you don't need to be taking a 10-minute shower. 5-minute shower, you're getting close, maybe 2.5 minutes. Yeah, you just saved a ton of water. Take shorter showers. Learn how to fix leaks. If you have a leaky faucet in your house, try to get it fixed. I know it may not seem like a lot, but a leaky faucet over the course of a year can waste up to 5,000 gallons of water. So fix those leaks. When you're helping your parents wash the car on the weekend, make sure you use a bucket and what we call a nozzle on the end of the hose. A nozzle actually prevents water from just draining out into the street. You turn a hose on, it can lose 1,000 gallons of water an hour. So put that nozzle on the hose. When you're helping to do the dishes, if you're using a dishwasher, or consider if you're doing the laundry, a washing machine, as much as possible, try to wash only full loads. Consider this: if you only fill it up halfway, and then you close the door and you hit start, well, what about the other half? Well, then you got to put those in. You got to close the door and hit start. You just did 2 loads you could have done in 1 load. So you just use twice as much water. So try to wash only full loads. Okay, there's a lot of ways to save water. I just introduced you to a few of them, something to think about. Now let's talk about the company I work for, CVWD. That's Coachella Valley Water District. And Tudor Tortoise here, he's telling us that CVWD is also helping to save water. Now we have many programs in place to help people save water, but I only have time to focus on one right now, and it is connected to this thing that we call the canal. Perhaps you've heard of it. We have this water supply that runs through the Coachella Valley. It looks like a river. It's not a river. This was built by people, and it is filled with river water from the Colorado River, but we call it the Coachella Canal. Here's a picture of it. This actually is our biggest water saver of everything that we do. And if you look at the canal, you may scratch your head and you say, how is that helping to save water? Well, let me explain. It's actually connected to farming. Okay, now, it turns out there are a lot of farms in the Coachella Valley. And our farmers, I like to say they grow everything from A to Z, everything from artichokes to zucchini. And it's pretty much true, and everything in between. In this picture here, there's a farmer growing some butterleaf lettuce. And the thing is, back in the old days, the farmers had only one place to get their water from. That was the aquifer. And I'd like you to notice what happened to the aquifer back when the farmers were taking water from the aquifer. Because as you know, these plants are very thirsty. They need a lot of water to grow. So back in the old days, the farmers would take water from the aquifer, and the aquifer went down. In fact, it was being threatened to completely dry up. And as a water district, we talked to the farmers and we said, farmers, you have to stop taking water from the aquifer. If you don't stop, we're going to run out. And the farmers said, okay, we understand, but we need water. I mean, where are we going to get water from to grow the food that we grow? And the water district said, how about this? We, the water district, will build you, the farmers, a canal. And we did. And again, here's a picture of the canal. The canal, 123 miles long, runs through the Coachella Valley. If you follow it back, it connects to the Colorado River. Water goes from the Colorado River into the canal through the farmland. And now, when the farmers need to grow their crops, like here, these are grapes, rather than taking water from the aquifer, where are they taking it from? The canal. Yes, the canal is sending water out to the farms. So, what do you think that did to the aquifer? It saved the aquifer. That's what it did. With that water staying in the aquifer because farmers weren't using it, the aquifer recovered. The water came back up. And so we like to say that the canal single-handedly saved the aquifer. It pretty much did. So the canal is very important. Now, with that said, as a water district, we're always struggling to keep this aquifer in balance. Remember, we're always taking water out of it, and we're always trying to get water back into it. Sometimes we take more water out than goes in. Sometimes we put more water out than is taken out, or goes in than is taken out. Right now, things are looking really good for the aquifer. For the last 10 years, the aquifer has been continuing to rise, to come up. So that's a good thing. But the Coachella Valley Water District, we're not the only ones involved in keeping the aquifer full. You can help too. So when you save water, you are actually helping to save our aquifer. So make sure you save that water. Don't waste it. Okay, now I'm almost done. Thanks for hanging in there. I'm going to end by talking about canal safety. The canal, as we mentioned, very important source of water for us. We need it. It saved our aquifer, helps the farmers grow food. But it's also very dangerous. If you ever happen to come across the canal, please stay away from it. In fact, we put up signs all around the canal that says, stay out, no nades. And people say, no nades, what is that? I was told it's Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, but I pretend to. No nades, no swimming. Stay out, no nades. The reason we want people to stay away from the canal is because the water is very swift. The canal itself is deep. Water moves very quickly. It can pull people under and they can drown. So please stay away. How deep is the canal? At its deepest point, it's 12 feet deep. But really what makes it dangerous, you see the sides are covered with cement. They're very steep. They're very slippery. If somebody gets in, they can't get a handhold or a foothold to get out. And also, the narrow channel at the bottom, water travels very quickly through it. But at the top, it tends to travel more slowly. And this can create an unusual flow of water. We call it an undertow or an undercurrent. And what that means is if somebody gets trapped in it, it can actually pull them under and they can drown, even if they're a good swimmer. If they get caught in that, it just down they go, and then they drown. So please stay away from the canals. Additionally, we have these, we call them check gates or check structures, emergency control gates built at intervals along the canal. And these are used to control the flow of water. The danger here is if you're above this structure, the water moving through it is sucking you towards it. And it'll move you pretty fast. It'll pull you along at about 6 miles an hour. And if you get sucked into that, then that's it. That's bad news. So you get the idea. Danger. Stay out. Stay away. Okay. Gates and fences. We have them around the canal in the populated areas. They're locked to keep you safe. So that's that. Quick review and we are done. Okay, what did we learn today? Who are the first people that lived here in the Coachella Valley? Yes, the Cahuilla Indians. We learned that they got their water from 4 sources. Let's see if we can name them. Source number 1, melted snow runoff from the mountains. Source number 2, old Lake Kawaii. Source number 3, naturally occurring springs called oases. And number 4, from hand-dug wells. Okay. We still dig wells today. The water that comes to your house comes from a well. We learned that there's a lot of water in our aquifer, but that we should not waste it. So again, these pictures remind us of different ways we can save water. And we also learned that the biggest water saver in the valley, even today, is the Coachella Canal. The water that's in the canal comes from which river? Yes, Colorado River. Do we drink this water? No. Well, we don't drink it. What do we use it for? Yes, farming. We sell it to the farmers and they use it to grow food for us to eat. Should a person ever swim in a canal? No. Thank you. Stay out, stay alive. That is our motto. That is all I have. Thank you for hanging in there. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.